Lord Peter took the chair that Lady Brackenstall indicated with a gesture that managed to be both languid and dismissive, the sort of movement a woman might make when directing servants to remove an inconvenient cushion. He settled himself with the ease of a man entirely accustomed to uncomfortable furniture in other people's houses, crossing his legs with deliberate casualness whilst his eyes conducted a thorough inventory of the room. The morning light filtered through those heavy velvet curtains that seemed designed specifically to resist illumination, cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. Inspector Croft remained standing, his notebook already in hand, prepared to record whatever Lady Brackenstall might say with the earnest attention of a man taking dictation from the Almighty himself. "My dear Lady Brackenstall," Wimsey began, his tone suggesting he was about to discuss the weather rather than murder, "I find myself in that peculiar position of complete ignorance, which is simultaneously my greatest asset and my most reliable excuse for asking tedious questions. Perhaps you might begin by telling me precisely what has occurred, and do endeavor to be specific about times and sequences. Inspector Croft is admirable in most respects, but I find he tends toward the impressionistic when it comes to chronology." Lady Brackenstall drew a handkerchief from her lap. It was already crumpled, Wimsey noted, suggesting it had been worked over more than once, and pressed it to her lips in that practiced gesture one sees in plays. "It was the lamp," she said suddenly, as though this explained everything, and Wimsey felt a flicker of interest that he took care not to display. "I beg your pardon," he inquired with polite bewilderment. "The lamp in the library. Lord Brackenstall was found this morning beneath it, you see. Dead. Simply dead. Lying there on the carpet as though he'd simply decided to expire in the most inconvenient manner imaginable." Inspector Croft intervened with the sort of earnest gravity one associates with coroner's reports. "The body was discovered at approximately 6:30 this morning by Mrs. Henning, the housekeeper. His lordship was lying face down near the desk, with a letter opener, an antique affair, Italian silver, lodged quite firmly between the shoulder blades. Death appears to have been instantaneous, or nearly so." Wimsey's eyebrow rose with the precision of a drawbridge at the approach of particularly interesting barges. A letter opener. How remarkably civilized of the murderer. One might almost imagine it was an accident, save for the fact that letter openers, in my experience, possess a deplorable tendency to remain where one places them rather than migrating of their own volition into people's backs. He turned to Lady Brackenstall with an expression of gentle inquiry. "You were in the house, I take it, and you heard nothing? No cries of distress, no sounds suggestive of struggle?" "I was asleep," she replied, and Wimsey observed that her fingers had begun to work the handkerchief in a manner suggesting nervous tension rather than theatrical display. "My bedroom is at the far end of the east wing. The library is in the west, and the soundproofing, well, the walls are quite thick, you understand. Old houses are like that." Wimsey found himself mentally cataloguing this information with the sort of attention usually reserved for bibliographies. The house was large enough that one might kill someone in the library without awakening someone in the east wing. The architecture itself, in other words, was complicit in the crime. How very convenient. "And Lord Brackenstall's habits?" he pressed. "Did he customarily retire early or late? Was he an insomniac prone to nocturnal correspondence? Or was his presence in the library, at whatever hour he met his demise, an unusual occurrence?" Inspector Croft consulted his notes with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that accuracy in small matters occasionally compensates for confusion in large ones. According to the servants, his lordship had been in his study until approximately 9 o'clock yesterday evening. He was seen by young Mr. Adrian Carmichael, who reports that his uncle was in excellent spirits, even jovial, speaking of having recently acquired a Rembrandt and discussing plans for the autumn shooting season. Wimsey's expression suggested he was cataloguing this information somewhere between the location of the library and the thickness of the walls. Excellent spirits and murder make rather an odd pair, don't they? One generally expects the victim to have done something to deserve it, or at least to have been engaged in activities sufficiently nefarious to justify the expenditure of effort required to stick a letter opener between one's shoulder blades. He rose and walked to the window, peering out at the grounds beyond with an air of casual interest. "I should very much like to examine the library, and indeed the body, though I confess that the former is likely to prove more illuminating than the latter. Corpses, in my experience, are remarkably uninformative about their own demise, being fatally inclined toward silence at precisely the moment when one most desires them to speak." As he moved toward the door, he paused with the casual grace of a man who has just remembered something only slightly important. "One more matter, Lady Brackenstall. That lamp beside your chair, the one that's been burning despite the perfectly adequate daylight. Do you customarily leave it alight during the morning, or is this a recent habit?" She followed his gaze, and something flickered behind her carefully maintained composure. Surprise, perhaps, or the subtle recognition that she had been observed more closely than she had anticipated. It helps me think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Whimsy smiled, the sort of smile that suggested he had just heard something of profound significance disguised as nothing at all, and proceeded toward the door with Inspector Croft following in his wake, like a slightly anxious spaniel, attempting to keep pace with a greyhound. The library at Brackenstall Hall was precisely the sort of room one might have anticipated. All leather-bound volumes and mahogany shelving, with the faintly musty odor that suggests books have been purchased primarily for their decorative qualities rather than their intellectual content. The body, however, had been removed to the local doctor's surgery, a fact for which Whimsy felt a certain gratitude, as he had never developed a taste for the early examination of corpses before breakfast. Inspector Croft positioned himself near the desk, with the air of a man revealing a particularly elaborate stage set, gesturing toward the spot where Lord Brackenstall had been discovered. The letter opener was no longer present, having been catalogued as evidence with the sort of meticulous attention to procedure that suggested someone in the local constabulary possessed at least a passing acquaintance with forensic methodology. "He was found here," Croft explained, "lying precisely where you see that slight discoloration in the carpet. The weapon was removed by Dr. Hartley, who arrived at 7:30. No signs of struggle, no indication that his lordship had attempted to defend himself or cry out. The doctor's preliminary assessment is that death occurred sometime between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning, though he emphasizes that the precise determination must wait a more thorough examination." Whimsy knelt beside the carpet stain with the careful attention of a man examining a particularly interesting manuscript, his eyes conducting an almost microscopic survey of the floor. "The blood pattern," he observed, "suggests that Lord Brackenstall was indeed lying precisely as described when the weapon was withdrawn. There's no spatter consistent with movement or struggle, which indicates either extreme speed on the part of the assailant or, and this is rather more interesting, a victim who was entirely unaware of the attack until it was too late." He rose with fluid grace and moved to the desk, examining the papers arranged upon it with the focused intensity of someone reading poetry in an unknown language. What was he doing here? Correspondence? Accounts? Consulting his Rembrandt documentation? Croft consulted his notes. Though Whimsy suspected the information had been provided to him moments before, the notebook serving primarily as a comforting object rather than an actual repository of facts. The servants report that his lordship often worked late in the library, attending to estate matters or personal correspondence. There was a letter on the desk, begun but apparently not finished, addressed to his solicitor regarding alterations to his will. It was never sealed or sent. Whimsy's interest, which had been politely moderate, shifted into something approaching genuine engagement. His will. How very melodramatic. One almost imagines we're operating within the conventions of a penny dreadful rather than actual criminology. And these alterations, were they significant? According to the letter, Croft replied, his lordship wished to increase the bequests to his ward, Miss Miranda Carmichael, and to make formal provisions for his nephew, Mr. Adrian Carmichael, who has been living at the Hall on what might charitably be discreet. Bed, as in definite terms. There were also suggestions that he intended to revise certain arrangements regarding Lady Brackenstall. Whimsy moved to the window, which opened onto the grounds beyond, and examined the latch with meticulous care. The window was locked, the frame pristine, showing no signs of disturbance. He turned back to the room, his expression suggesting that something about its arrangement was speaking to him in a language only he could comprehend. "The clock," he said suddenly, pointing to the ornate mantelpiece above the fireplace. "It reads 3 o'clock. When was it last wound?" Croft blinked at this apparent non sequitur with the confusion of a man confronted by a question in advanced Sanskrit. "Aye. The servants maintain it, I believe." "Why?" Whimsy ignored the question with the casual dismissal of a man who has already moved on to more interesting problems. "And the door? The library door. Was it locked when the body was discovered?" "No, my lord. It was found ajar, as though his lordship had either not secured it behind him or had been expecting someone." Whimsy walked to the door in question, examining the lock with care. It was a modern mechanism, installed perhaps 20 years prior, showing no signs of tampering or forcing. He opened and closed it several times, listening with apparent fascination to the sound it made. "Soundproofing is rather more difficult to achieve than one might imagine," he mused. "The human voice, carrying as it does such frequency variation, tends to penetrate walls that might successfully muffle other sounds. A scream, for instance, would have been heard throughout much of the house. But the sound of a door opening? That might pass unnoticed, particularly if the household were asleep and the hearing of any wakeful individuals were distracted by other concerns." He turned to face Croft with an expression of polite inquiry that somehow suggested he was simultaneously conducting an examination rather than a conversation. "I should very much like to speak with the household inspector. The servants first, if you would be so kind, beginning with Mrs. Henning and old Garrett, and then, if you don't object to my conducting what might be charitably described as preliminary interviews, I should like to speak with Mr. Adrian Carmichael, Miss Miranda Carmichael, and of course the grieving widow." Croft, who had begun to sense that Lord Peter Whimsy was conducting an investigation along lines entirely parallel to his own, and that these lines might occasionally intersect in ways productive of actual results, agreed with something approaching relief. As they moved toward the door, Whimsy paused once more, his attention fixed upon the lamp that stood upon the corner table near the window, a heavy brass affair with a green shade, currently unlit despite the comparative dimness of the library's interior. "That lamp," he said thoughtfully. "Has it always stood there, or has it recently been relocated?" Croft consulted his notes, and then, finding nothing, turned to ask the nearest footman, who confirmed that the lamp had been moved from the far side of the room sometime within the past week, though no one seemed entirely certain when or why. Whimsy nodded as though this answered a question of profound significance, and proceeded into the hallway with the deliberate pace of a man who has begun to perceive the first faint outline of a pattern. Mrs. Henning occupied that peculiar position within the household hierarchy that places one simultaneously above and below the other servants, respected for her longevity and institutional knowledge, yet bound by the constraints of her employment to maintain a careful distance from those she served. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with the sort of grey hair that suggested a life conducted primarily indoors, and the measured movements of someone who had learned that haste invariably led to broken china. She seated herself in the small parlor designated for this interview with the careful precision of a woman placing herself in a chair that might disapprove of her presence, her hands folded in her lap, with the sort of composure that suggested centuries of practice in appearing simultaneously attentive and invisible. Whimsy regarded her with the focused interest of a man examining a particularly complex medieval manuscript. "Mrs. Henning, I understand you have served Lord Brackenstall for approximately 30 years. That represents a considerable investment of your life in this household, and I should imagine you possess a rather comprehensive understanding of its rhythms and peculiarities." She inclined her head slightly, neither confirming nor denying, leaving the assertion hanging between them like a question posed in a foreign language. "You discovered the body at 6:30 this morning. What prompted you to enter the library at that particular hour?" "His lordship took his breakfast at 8 o'clock precisely," she replied, her voice carrying the flat tones of someone delivering information that had been repeated so often it had lost all emotional content. I went to ensure the room was in proper order before he descended, to light the fire and open the curtains as is customary. The door was ajar, as I've told Inspector Croft, and I found him lying there on the carpet, quite dead. Whimsy leaned forward with an air of intense interest that somehow managed not to be threatening. The fire, was it already lit, or did you discover the room in darkness? Mrs. Henning's hesitation was barely perceptible, a minute shift in her composure that suggested she was selecting her words with more care than the question might have seemed. To warrant. The fire was cold, my lord. The room was dark save for the lamp, the green-shaded one by the window. It was burning, though there was no good reason for it to be, given the daylight approaching. Whimsy's eyebrow rose with the precision of a conductor's baton. The lamp was burning, but Inspector Croft mentioned nothing of this. Surely such a detail would merit inclusion in his preliminary report. I extinguished it, Mrs. Henning said quietly. Before I raised the alarm, I thought, that is to say, I didn't wish to appear foolish. It seemed like an odd detail to mention, a mere lamp burning in an unoccupied room. Whimsy sat back with the expression of a man who has just heard a symphony premiere and found it rather better than anticipated. Odd details, Mrs. Henning, are precisely my specialty. The question of why a lamp should be burning in the library throughout the night becomes remarkably interesting when one considers that Lord Brackenstall was presumably working at his desk, where the electric lights would have been perfectly adequate. Why would he leave a separate lamp burning when he departed? She offered no answer, which Whimsy accepted as the truth that it was. He proceeded with the methodical patience of a man who understood that information emerged not from direct interrogation, but from the careful accumulation of apparently unrelated facts. Tell me about the household as it has been recently. Has Lord Brackenstall's marriage to Lady Eleanor proved harmonious? And what of the younger members, Mr. Adrian and Miss Miranda Carmichael? Has their presence been entirely uncontroversial? Mrs. Henning's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His lordship was fond of Miss Miranda. As for Mr. Adrian, he has only recently taken up residence here permanently. Prior to that, his visits were intermittent. And Lady Brackenstall? How does she occupy hers? Elf. She reads primarily. And she paints occasionally, though I've seen little progress in her work. She has redecorated the morning room twice in the 18 months since her marriage, and she takes long walks in the grounds, often quite late in the evening. Whimsy filed this away with the same careful attention he had given to the matter of the lamp. She takes walks at night? During the autumn months, I should imagine, when the weather can be rather unpredictable? She does, my lord, regardless of the weather. He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the grounds with an expression suggesting he was observing something of particular interest. One final matter, Mrs. Henning. On the night of Lord Brackenstall's death, did you observe anything unusual? Any servants moving through the corridors? Any sounds that might have been unexpected? She hesitated again, and this time the hesitation was longer, more fraught with the weight of something unsaid. There was a sound, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometime after midnight. A door closing, I thought, though I couldn't say which one. It woke me, and I lay awake for perhaps an hour, listening, but heard nothing further. Whimsy turned from the window with an expression of genuine interest. Which door do you imagine it might have been? The library entrance, or perhaps one of the external doors leading to the grounds? I couldn't say, my lord. Sound carries strangely in old houses. He dismissed her with a courtesy that seemed to genuinely surprise her, and as she rose to depart, he added almost as an afterthought, One more thing, Mrs. Henning. When you extinguished the lamp this morning, did you observe whether it was warm to the touch? Fresh from use, as it were, or had it been burning for some hours? Her face paled almost imperceptibly. It was quite warm, my lord. Hot enough that I had to be careful not to burn my fingers. Whimsy smiled, a smile of such complexity that it seemed to contain multitudes, and gestured toward the door. As Mrs. Henning departed, he turned to find Inspector Croft regarding him with the mixture of admiration and bewilderment that generally characterized the local police force's response to his investigations. The lamp, Croft began tentatively, but Whimsy raised a hand with the delicacy of a conductor silencing an over-enthusiastic section. The lamp, Whimsy said with the air of a man explaining something of profound yet obvious significance, is precisely the sort of detail that the amateur criminal overlooks, whilst simultaneously being the detail that reveals the entire mechanism of the crime. You see, Inspector, a lamp burning in an apparently unoccupied room at 6 in the morning suggests either carelessness on the part of the user or deliberate design on the part of someone wishing to indicate that the room had been occupied throughout the night. Mrs. Henning's observation that it was warm to the touch narrows the question considerably. It had been burning, then, for some hours prior to her discovery of the body. The question becomes, why? Croft's expression suggested he was contemplating a mathematical proof conducted in a language he did not entirely comprehend. Whimsy, however, was already moving toward the parlor door with the purposeful stride of a man who had identified his next source of information. "I should very much like to interview young Mr. Adrian Carmichael. Has he been apprised of his uncle's death, or are we still operating within the realm of ignorance regarding the household's current emotional state?" "He's been informed," Croft replied, falling into step beside him. "He's taken it rather hard from what I gather. They were quite close, apparently. He's been in his room since the news broke, T. Huffy came down for breakfast this morning and was present when the body was discovered, after the servants had moved it." Whimsy's pace slowed almost imperceptibly. "He was present when the body was discovered? How very convenient. One wonders if that represents genuine involvement or merely the sort of morbid fascination that younger men sometimes display when confronted with death. They found Adrian Carmichael in what appeared to be a morning room adjacent to the library, a young man of perhaps 28, with the sort of attractive features that suggested he had never been required to cultivate any compensating virtues. He rose when they entered, his expression shifting from the carefully constructed melancholy of grief to something approaching nervousness as he recognized Whimsy. "Lord Peter," he said, extending a hand that was slightly too damp with perspiration. "Inspector Croft mentioned you might be calling. It's rather extraordinary, isn't it? Uncle dead, and we haven't the faintest idea who might have done it." Whimsy accepted the hand with the briefest possible contact and settled himself into a chair with the ease of a man entirely accustomed to interviewing suspects, though his tone remained conversational, almost intimate. "Extraordinary indeed, Mr. Carmichael, though I confess that most murders, when examined closely, prove to be rather less mysterious than initially supposed. Usually, the solution lies in the realm of motive and opportunity, combined with a certain psychological predisposition toward violence. Tell me, when did you last see your uncle alive?" Adrian's eyes flickered toward the window, as though seeking escape through that avenue. "Yesterday evening. I was in his study around 9 o'clock discussing some investments he was considering. He seemed in excellent spirits, actually, rather more animated than I've seen him in months." "And you retired shortly thereafter?" "Yes, I went to my room around 9:30. I read for a while. I was in the middle of a rather absorbing novel, and I suppose I fell asleep around 11. Whimsy's expression suggested that this information was of profound importance, though his next question seemed almost tangential. "Your room, which wing of the house does it occupy?" "The east wing, same as Lady Brackenstall. We're quite distant from the library, I'm afraid. The walls are rather thick, old stone and all that. One could scarcely hear anything from there." Whimsy leaned back in his chair with an air of casual interest that somehow conveyed the impression that he was simultaneously conducting a cross-examination with the precision of a barrister before the Old Bailey. "You seem rather well informed about the acoustic properties of the house, Mr. Carmichael. That suggests you've had occasion to test them, as it were. Have you attempted to hear sounds from the library whilst in your room?" Adrian's discomfort became more pronounced. Once or twice, perhaps, Uncle did tend to work rather late, and one occasionally heard the sound of him moving about down here. It was more curiosity than anything else. Curiosity about what specifically? The nature of his work? Or perhaps concern regarding his well-being? Simply wondering what kept him occupied at such hours, I suppose. The answer came too quickly, suggesting it had been rehearsed. Whimsy rose and moved to the window, peering out at the grounds with an air of abstract contemplation. "I understand that Lord Brackenstall intended to alter his will rather substantially. You and your sister stood to benefit considerably from these proposed changes. That must have been welcome news. Adrian's face flushed slightly. We were hardly in desperate straits, Lord Peter. Uncle was always generous, and our financial situatio, N, is quite comfortable. Yet comfortable situations have a tendency to become less so, Whimsy observed with the detached tone of a man stating a meteorological fact, particularly when one's income is dependent upon the goodwill of a relative. Your uncle was a man of strong opinions, I'm told. Had there been disagreements between you? Tensions that might have arisen from his recent marriage, perhaps? None whatsoever, Adrian insisted, but his hands had begun to betray him, clenching and unclenching in his lap. Uncle's marriage was his own affair. We were pleased to see him happy. Whimsy turned from the window with an expression that suggested he had just observed something of particular interest in the garden below. Tell me, Mr. Carmichael, did you happen to notice any unusual activity in the house last night? Doors opening or closing? Servants moving about? Anything that struck you as out of the ordinary? Adrian's hesitation was barely perceptible, but it was there, a minute pause that suggested he was weighing the consequences of truth against the advantages of convenient ignorance. I heard something, he admitted finally. Around 1 o'clock, I believe. A door closing. I'm not certain which one. I assumed it was one of the servants attending to some household matter and thought nothing more of it until this morning. Whimsy's interest in Adrian's account of the mysterious door appeared to transform from casual inquiry into something approaching genuine engagement, though his expression remained one of polite detachment. He returned to his chair with the deliberate movements of a man settling in to conduct a more intensive examination, his grey eyes fixing upon Adrian with an intensity that suggested he was simultaneously observing multiple layers of truth and untruth. 1 o'clock, he repeated, as though tasting the words for accuracy. A precise hour, Mr. C. Carmichael. One wonders how you arrived at such specificity, given that you claim to have been reading and subsequently asleep. Did you happen to consult your watch at the moment you heard this door? Adrian's flush deepened perceptibly. I didn't consult my watch precisely, but my clock chimed once, the quarter hour, I believe, and then shortly after I heard the sound, so it must have been close to 1 o'clock. Whimsy's eyebrow rose with the delicate precision of a conductor, indicating that a particular instrumental section had entered slightly off-key. The quarter hour would suggest 1:15, not 1 o'clock precisely, though I suppose in the realm of nocturnal observations, such temporal ambiguities are scarcely remarkable. Tell me, did this door-closing sound originate from within the house, or might it have been an external door? One leading to the grounds, perhaps? I couldn't say with certainty, Adrian replied, and Whimsy detected in his voice the particular quality of someone speaking a truth that nonetheless felt like a lie in context. The sound carried strangely, echoing through the corridors. It might have been the library door, actually. Now that you mention it, I believe it might have been. Whimsy rose and excused himself with the courtesy of a man departing a conversation that had yielded its secrets, at least temporarily. In the hallway he found Inspector Croft, awaiting him with the patience of a man accustomed to being kept in suspense regarding his own investigation. Interesting, Whimsy mused, apparently addressing the architectural features of the hallway rather than the inspector. The younger Carmichael claims to have heard a door at approximately 1 o'clock, or perhaps 1:15. Mrs. Henning claims to have heard a door sometime after midnight. We have, therefore, either two separate incidents or one incident misremembered by one or both parties. The question becomes which. He proceeded toward the back stairs with the purposefulness of a man who had identified his next destination before fully understanding why he had identified it. I should like to examine Lord Brackenstall's bedroom, if you would be so kind, and then, subsequently, I should very much like to examine the library clock and determine whether it is operating with accuracy. The bedroom proved to be precisely what one might have anticipated, a room of considerable size and modest decoration, suggesting that Lord Brackenstall had either possessed minimal interest in his personal surroundings or had delegated their arrangement to someone whose tastes ran toward the conservative and uninspired. The bed was enormous, a Victorian confection of carved oak and heavy damask, positioned to afford a view of the gardens beyond. Wimsey examined it with an air of casual interest that somehow suggested he was conducting a comprehensive forensic examination. The covers were neat, undisturbed, suggesting either that Lord Brackenstall had never retired to bed the previous evening, or that someone had taken considerable care to restore the room to apparent order. Was the bed disturbed when it was discovered? Wimsey inquired of Croft, who consulted his notes with the mechanical precision of a man referring to a script. The servants report that it appeared undisturbed. Lord Brackenstall's nightclothes were not laid out, which was apparently unusual. Typically, his valet, we have a man named Pritchard who serves in that capacity, would prepare the room before his lordship retired. Pritchard reports that he performed this duty yesterday evening but was subsequently dismissed for the night around 10 o'clock. Wimsey moved to the wardrobe and examined its contents with the attention of a man reading a particularly complex narrative written in the language of fabric and form. Lord Brackenstall was killed in the library, lying at his desk, apparently engaged in correspondence regarding alterations to his will. The letter was unfinished, suggesting he was interrupted. Yet no one heard him cry out or struggle. And this morning his bed appears never to have been slept in. What does this suggest to you, Inspector? Croft's expression indicated that it suggested primarily confusion. Wimsey continued without waiting for a response. It suggests that Lord Brackenstall never intended to retire to bed. Either he was planning to work throughout the night, which would be unusual though not unprecedented for a man of his age and temperament, or he had some appointment that required him to remain dressed and alert. The question becomes with whom and for what purpose. They descended to the library once more, where Wimsey proceeded directly to the mantelpiece clock, examining it with meticulous care. His expression shifted slightly as he manipulated the clock's mechanism, listening to its operation with an intensity that suggested he was hearing something of profound significance in its ticking. "This clock," he announced finally, "is operating at approximately 7 minutes slow. Not dramatically slow, you understand, but consistently, reliably slow. A person glancing at it in dim light might easily misread the hour, particularly if their observation was made through the residual confusion of awakening from sleep." He turned to Croft with an expression that somehow conveyed the impression that the entire landscape of the investigation had shifted fundamentally. Which means that when Adrian Carmichael heard his clock chime what he believed to be 1:15, the actual time was approximately 1:22, and when Mrs. Henning reported hearing a door sometime after midnight, the actual time was considerably later. The timeline, Inspector, is beginning to acquire a certain coherence. Before Croft could formulate a response, a footman appeared in the library doorway with the urgent posture of someone bearing news of consequence. "Begging your pardon, my Lord Inspector, but there's been a development. Lady Brackenstall has requested your immediate presence in the morning room. It appears Miss Miranda Carmichael has something she wishes to tell you regarding last night's events." Wimsey exchanged a glance with Croft that suggested they had perhaps been examining the problem from an insufficiently complex angle. They proceeded toward the morning room with the measured pace of men approaching a revelation that might fundamentally alter their understanding of the case's underlying structure. Miss Miranda Carmichael occupied a chair in the morning room with the careful posture of someone who had been coached extensively in the art of appearing appropriately distressed without surrendering to genuine emotion. She was younger than her brother by perhaps 4 years, with features that suggested they shared genetic material but had processed it with vastly different results. Where Adrian possessed a kind of surface attractiveness that relied upon conventional proportions and careful grooming, Miranda possessed something more dangerous, an intelligence that manifested itself in the precise arrangement of her expression and the calculated movements of her hands. Lady Brackenstall stood beside the fireplace with an air of proprietorial concern, as though she had orchestrated this confession and was prepared to manage its consequences with the diplomatic skill of someone accustomed to navigating the complexities of household secrets. Wimsey settled himself into a chair with the ease of a man who had conducted countless interviews with young women attempting to navigate the treacherous waters between loyalty and self-preservation. his expression suggesting gentle interest rather than interrogation. "Miss Carmichael," he began, his tone carrying the quality of a man engaging in casual conversation rather than serious inquiry, "I understand you have information regarding last evening's events that you feel compelled to share. How very commendable of you to place the interests of justice above those of family loyalty. Though I confess I am curious to know what prompted this sudden emergence of conscience." Miranda's eyes flickered toward Lady Brackenstall, then back to Whimsy, suggesting some complex negotiation had occurred between them prior to this interview. "I wasn't entirely truthful this morning when Inspector Croft questioned me," she said finally, her voice possessing the careful modulation of someone reciting a prepared statement. "I told him that I retired early and heard nothing of significance. In fact, I was awake quite late last night. I couldn't sleep, and I went for a walk in the grounds around midnight." Whimsy's expression suggested this information was of considerable interest, though his next question seemed almost tangential. "You took a nocturnal walk in November, in weather that I am told was rather inclement. How very industrious of you. Did you happen to observe anything of particular interest during this constitutional?" "I saw Eleanor, Lady Brackenstall, leaving the house through the side door near the library," Miranda replied, and Whimsy detected in her voice a certain satisfaction at the delivery of this revelation, as though she had been anticipating the moment for some hours. She was dressed for outdoors, carrying what appeared to be a small bag or portfolio of some kind. "I didn't wish to encounter her, so I remained concealed in the shrubbery." Lady Brackenstall's composure shifted almost imperceptibly, a minute rearrangement of her facial muscles that suggested she had not anticipated this particular betrayal. "Miranda, that's not—" she began, but Whimsy raised a hand with the delicate courtesy of a man requesting silence in a library. "One moment, Lady Brackenstall. Miss Carmichael's account is of considerable interest. Please continue. What time would you estimate this occurred?" "Approximately midnight," Miranda replied. "I checked my watch when I heard the door close, because I thought it might be Uncle, and I was curious whether he was taking a late walk as well." Whimsy's grey eyes fixed upon Miranda with an intensity that somehow remained entirely non-threatening. "And did you observe Lady Brackenstall's return? How long was she absent from the house?" "I'm not certain of the exact duration," Miranda admitted. "I grew cold and returned to my room, so I didn't observe her departure for the entire period. I should estimate she was gone for perhaps 30 to 40 minutes. Whimsy turned to Lady Brackenstall with an expression of polite inquiry that somehow conveyed the impression that he was simultaneously sympathetic to her predicament and entirely certain of her guilt in whatever she was about to confess. "Lady Brackenstall, Miss Carmichael's account presents certain difficulties with the timeline as previously established. Might you clarify the nature of your nocturnal perambulation?" "I confess to being curious regarding the contents of the bag Miss Carmichael observed." Lady Brackenstall's carefully maintained composure fractured, not dramatically, but with the gradual deterioration of a wall subjected to prolonged pressure. She sank into a chair with the movements of someone whose strings had been suddenly severed. "I went to meet someone," she said quietly. "A person from my past, before I married Lord Brackenstall. He wrote to me expressing remorse for certain actions, requesting an opportunity to speak with me privately. I arranged to meet him in the grounds at midnight." Whimsy's eyebrow rose with the subtle precision of a conductor, indicating that a solo instrument had entered prematurely. "How very melodramatic. A midnight assignation in November weather, with letters expressing remorse. One almost imagines we're operating within the conventions of penny romance rather than actual criminology. I should very much like to know the identity of this mysterious figure from your past." Lady Brackenstall hesitated, and in that hesitation, Whimsy perceived the entire architecture of her dilemma, the necessity of betraying one confidence against the alternative of potentially being implicated in a murder. "His name is Thomas Ashford," she said finally. "We were engaged before I came to London and subsequently took theatrical work. He abandoned me when he discovered I was performing on the stage, which he considered beneath his social position. When my father lost his fortune, Thomas reappeared, expressing regret and requesting reconciliation." "And did you reconcile?" Whimsy inquired, his tone remaining conversational, though his eyes had acquired a certain focused quality. "No," Lady Brackenstall replied. "I told him I had built a new life and no longer required his redemption or his regret. We spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, and then I returned to the house." Whimsy rose and moved to the window with the purposefulness of a man who had identified his next avenue of investigation. "This Thomas Ashford, is he local to the area?" "He resides in the village," Miranda interjected, as though she had been conducting her own investigation parallel to Whimsy's. "I recognized him from the theatrical company that occasionally performs in the county. He's been acting work, primarily in provincial productions. He was also, if I'm not mistaken, Lord Brackenstall's godson." Whimsy turned from the window with an expression that suggested he had just heard a symphony premiere that had not entirely met his expectations. "How very convenient," he murmured. "A rejected suitor, a reformed past, and a connection to the victim through familial bonds. The plot thickens considerably, though not, I suspect, in the manner we have been assuming." Inspector Croft's expression suggested that the landscape of the investigation had transformed from a reasonably comprehensible murder into something considerably more labyrinthine. He consulted his notes with the mechanical desperation of a man seeking solid ground in quicksand. "Lord Brackenstall's godson? There's no mention of this in any of the household records. How did you come by this information, Miss Carmichael?" Miranda's expression acquired a quality of careful satisfaction, suggesting she, been anticipating precisely this question. "I recognized him from a theatrical program that was left in the morning room some months ago. The cast included a Thomas Ashford in a supporting role. I mentioned it to Uncle in passing, and he became quite dismissive, saying something about youthful indiscretions and foolish choices. I gathered there had been some falling out between them years ago." Whimsy's attention had shifted to something apparently minor, the arrangement of cushions on the sofa, the precise positioning of a vase of flowers on the mantelpiece. Yet his eyes suggested he was observing something of profound significance in these superficial details. "Lady Brackenstall," he said, without looking away from the arrangement of the room, "when you met with this Thomas Ashford in the grounds, did he make any reference to Lord Brackenstall? Any indication of why he had chosen this particular moment to reappear in your life?" Lady Brackenstall's hands had begun their familiar gesture of working the handkerchief into progressively smaller configurations. "He mentioned that Uncle had been ill, some heart troubles that had been troubling him. Thomas seemed to think that Uncle might be receptive to reconciliation, given his advancing age and mortality. It seemed a pretext, if I'm honest. I believe Thomas was simply seeking an opportunity to contact me indirectly." Whimsy turned from the window with an expression that suggested he had arrived at a conclusion of considerable importance. "Tell me, has anyone observed Thomas Ashford since last night? Has he been seen about the village, or has he, perhaps, taken his departure with remarkable alacrity?" Croft's confusion deepened. "I haven't questioned him yet, Lord Peter. Should I be considering him a prime suspect?" Whimsy's smile was the sort of smile that contained multitudes of unspoken observations. "Inspector, the cook question of whether Mr. Ashford murdered Lord Brackenstall is considerably less interesting than the question of whether he had any motive to do so. The timeline, as we are beginning to perceive it, presents certain difficulties for any straightforward interpretation." Lady Brackenstall departed the house at approximately midnight and returned some 30 to 40 minutes later. Lord Brackenstall was, we are told, working at his desk at 9 o'clock in the evening and was discovered dead at 6:30 in the morning. The precise time of death remains somewhat ambiguous, though the doctor's preliminary assessment suggests it occurred sometime between midnight and 4 o'clock. He began to pace the length of the morning room with the measured stride of a man conducting an internal soliloquy. Yet we have heard from both Adrian Carmichael and Mrs. Henning of sounds, doors opening or closing, at times that now appear to be considerably later than initially reported, given the 7-minute slow operation of the library clock, and we have a lamp burning in an apparently unoccupied room, warm to the touch when discovered in the early morning, suggesting recent use. The mechanism of the crime, Inspector, is beginning to acquire a certain coherence, though the identity of the perpetrator remains somewhat less than pellucid. Lady Brackenstall's voice emerged, small and frightened. "Lord Peter, surely you don't imagine that he would have—" Whimsy interrupted with the courtesy of a man who had heard this particular line of reasoning before. "What I imagine, Lady Brackenstall, is considerably less important than what the evidence suggests, and the evidence thus far suggests a crime considerably more complex than simple passion or revenge. Mr. Ashford's presence in the grounds at midnight is, I confess, somewhat inconvenient for his exoneration, but it is not, in itself, proof of his involvement in Lord Brackenstall's death." He gestured to Croft, with the air of a man delegating a task of secondary importance. "I should like you to bring Mr. Ashford here for questioning, Inspector, but proceed with discretion. If he has fled, his departure will itself constitute evidence of considerable interest. If he remains, his demeanor and responses may illuminate aspects of this case that remain currently obscured." Croft rose with the eagerness of a man finally given a task of concrete consequence. "I'll send someone to the village immediately, Lord Peter, and I'll begin making inquiries regarding his movements last night." As the inspector departed, Whimsy turned to Miranda with an expression of polite interest. "One final matter, Miss Carmichael. When you observed Lady Brackenstall departing the house, did she appear agitated or anxious? Or did her demeanor suggest the careful composure of someone engaged in a planned action?" Miranda's hesitation was barely perceptible. She seemed determined, I suppose, not anxious precisely, but purposeful. She moved as though she knew exactly where she was going and what she intended to do. Whimsy nodded as though this confirmed something he had suspected. He moved to a small writing desk positioned near the window and examined its contents with the focused attention of a man reading a particularly complex narrative. Within moments he had located a small leather journal, which he opened with the delicate care of someone handling an ancient manuscript. His eyes scanned the pages with an intensity that suggested each entry was communicating something of profound significance. "Interesting," he murmured. "Lady Brackenstall maintained a diary, it appears. And here, an entry from 3 days ago, it wrote again. I must see him, must understand his intentions. E grows suspicious. The lamp burns. Late. He works always so late now. Perhaps tonight. I cannot bear the uncertainty any longer." He closed the journal with the care of a man replacing a Gutenberg Bible in its vault. "It appears, Miss Carmichael, that your stepmother was considerably more agitated regarding Thomas Ashford's reappearance than she initially suggested to us. The question becomes whether this agitation was motivated by romantic considerations or by something considerably more sinister. Thomas Ashford arrived at Brackenstall Hall within the hour, escorted by Inspector Croft and a constable with the air of men transporting something of considerable fragility. He was a man of perhaps 35, with the sort of theatrical features that suggested a life spent performing rather than merely living, careful grooming, practiced expressions, movements that possessed a quality of calculated grace. Yet beneath this studied presentation, Whimsy detected something considerably less polished, the tension of someone operating under extreme psychological pressure, the slight tremor in his hands as he was ushered into the library where Whimsy waited with Lady Brackenstall and Miranda. "Mr. Ashford," Whimsy began, his tone conveying neither accusation nor sympathy but merely casual interest. "I understand you have recently renewed your acquaintance with Lady Brackenstall after a considerable hiatus. How very touching. A romance interrupted by the vicissitudes of fortune, subsequently rekindled by remorse and the passage of years. One might almost imagine it were the subject of a penny novel." Ashford's jaw tightened perceptibly at this characterization. "I came to apologize for past wrongs," he said stiffly. "Eleanor and I, Lady Brackenstall, had unfinished business. I thought it only right to attempt reconciliation." Whimsy's eyebrow rose with the precision of a conductor's baton. "And yet your reconciliati?" "On, according to Miss Carmichael's account, occurred at midnight in weather that was decidedly inclement. Curious timing for an apology, Mr. Ashford. One might almost imagine you were attempting to conduct this affair with maximum discretion, which in turn suggests some awareness that your presence and purpose might be subject to disapproval. Lady Brackenstall intervened, her voice emerging with a quality of defensive urgency. It was my suggestion that we meet late, Lord Peter. I didn't wish the household to become aware of Thomas's presence. Lord Brackenstall had been quite clear that any communication between us would be unwelcome. Wimsey settled himself into a chair with the ease of a man preparing to conduct an extended examination of considerable complexity. "How very considerate of you to protect your husband's sensibilities, Lady Brackenstall. Though I confess I am curious to understand why Lord Brackenstall would object so strenuously to your reconciliation with a man from your past. One might almost imagine there was some prior animosity between them, some history that extended beyond mere disapproval of an old romance." Ashford's expression flickered. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition that some secret had been inadvertently revealed. "Lord Brackenstall and I knew each other as boys," he said finally. "Our families were neighbours in Hampshire, but there was a falling out, a matter of considerable importance to both of us. When I discovered that Eleanor had married him, I was quite startled." Wimsey leaned forward with an intensity that somehow remained entirely conversational. "A falling out? How interestingly vague, Mr. Ashford. Tell me specifically what occurred between you and Lord Brackenstall that would cause such a complete rupture of relations." Ashford's hands had begun to exhibit the same nervous movements that Wimsey had observed I. "N. Adrian Carmichael. It involved a woman," he said quietly. "Years ago, when we were younger and considerably more foolish. There was a girl, Eleanor actually, though she later changed her name professionally, and we were both infatuated with her. Lord Brackenstall pursued her with considerably more vigour than I did, and he succeeded in winning her affection. But he became jealous, suspecting that I still harboured feelings for her. When she subsequently left him to pursue theatrical work, he blamed me for encouraging her departure." Wimsey's expression suggested that this information confirmed something he had already deduced. "So you were not, in fact, engaged to Lady Brackenstall?" Lady Brackenstall's face flushed with mortification. "Thomas and I were never engaged," she admitted. "I told you that because I was embarrassed. The truth is considerably more complex and considerably more stupid. I was in love with both of them at different times. With Thomas first, when I was barely 20, when he abandoned me, or rather when I chose to pursue theatrical work. I subsequently accepted Lord Brackenstall's suit." Wimsey rose and moved to the window, his expression suggesting that the entire landscape of the investigation had shifted into new configurations. "Which means that when Thomas Ashford reappeared in your life, Lord Brackenstall's reaction was not merely disapproval of an old romance, but rather fear that you might resurrect an earlier attachment. Fear, perhaps, of losing you to the man he had, in some sense, competed with for your affection years prior." He turned back to face the room with an expression of sudden clarity. And this fear, combined with Lord Brackenstall's recent awareness of his own mortality, his heart troubles, prompted him to consider altering his will, increasing the bequests to his ward and nephew whilst simultaneously reconsidering the Provisi. Ons for his wife. One wonders what prompted this reconsideration. Did he suspect an affair, Mr. Ashford? Did he somehow learn of your midnight rendezvous? Ashford's denial emerged too forcefully, too defensively. "I knew nothing of any affair. I came to apologize, nothing more." Wimsey's smile contained no warmth, yet somehow Lord Brackenstall learned of your presence in the grounds. Somehow he discovered that you and Lady Brackenstall had arranged a meeting. How do you suppose that occurred, Mr. Ashford? Did someone inform him? Did he observe you yourself? Before Ashford could respond, Wimsey moved to the library desk and retrieved the unfinished letter, the one regarding alterations to Lord Brackenstall's will. He held it up with the delicate care of a conductor, indicating a particularly important passage in a musical score. This letter was being composed when Lord Brackenstall met his death. It was addressed to his solicitor and spoke of significant alterations to his financial arrangements. But notice, Wimsey pointed to a specific passage. Here Lord Brackenstall has written something quite revealing. "I have been made aware of certain indiscretions that have convinced me that my trust has been fundamentally misplaced. He turned back to Ashford with an expression that somehow conveyed absolute certainty of guilt combined with profound sympathy for the circumstances that had produced it. "The question, Mr. Ashford, is not whether you murdered Lord Brackenstall. The question is rather whether you intended to, and whether someone else merely accomplished what you perhaps unconsciously desired." Ashford's denial emerged with a quality of desperation that suggested he perceived the walls of circumstantial evidence closing in upon him with remorseless precision. "I didn't kill him," he insisted, his voice acquiring a ragged quality. "Whatever you believe, whatever. The evidence suggests I didn't lay a hand on Lord Brackenstall. Yes, I was in the grounds. Yes, I met with Eleanor. But I returned to my lodgings in the village around 1 o'clock and remained there for the remainder of the night. My landlady can confirm this." Wimsey's expression remained unchanged, suggesting that Ashford's protestations of innocence were simultaneously believed and rendered essentially irrelevant by the larger architecture of the case. He moved to the mantelpiece and retrieved the green-shaded lamp that had been brought from the library, examining it with the focused attention of a man reading a particularly complex narrative written in the language of brass and glass. "The lamp," he said, addressing the room rather than any specific individual, "has proved to be of considerable importance throughout this investigation. It burned throughout the night, warm to the touch when discovered at 6:30 in the morning. Inspector Croft initially believed this to be merely a servant's oversight, the careless extinguishing of a light source. But the facts suggest something considerably more deliberate." He turned the lamp slowly, allowing the light to catch on its various surfaces. A lamp left burning serves multiple purposes for a criminal mind. It establishes an alibi of sorts, suggesting that someone was awake and occupied in the room where the lamp burned. It also, quite conveniently, covers the time of death with a certain ambiguity. If everyone assumes the victim was engaged in late-night work whilst the lamp burned, then the actual time of death becomes considerably more difficult to establish with precision. Lady Brackenstall's voice emerged, small and frightened. "Lord Peter, what are you suggesting?" Wimsey set the lamp down with deliberate care and regarded her with an expression that somehow conveyed both sympathy and absolute certainty of our involvement in some aspect of the crime's architecture. "I am suggesting, Lady Brackenstall, that you possessed considerably more knowledge of the events surrounding your husband's death than you have thus far revealed. I am suggesting that your midnight appointment with Thomas Ashford was in fact considerably more calculated than a mere romantic rendezvous. And I am suggesting that you were not in fact absent from the house when your husband met his demise." Lady Brackenstall's carefully maintained composure fractured completely. She rose from her chair with movements that suggested her entire body had become suddenly unfamiliar to her. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. "I swear to you, I didn't kill him." Miranda, watching from her position near the fireplace, exhibited an expression of extraordinary satisfaction. "I thought so," she said quietly. "I always thought Eleanor had something to do with it." Wimsey raised a hand, silencing this interruption with the courtesy of a man conducting an orchestra through a particularly delicate passage. "The question of who actually murdered Lord Brackenstall is considerably less interesting than the question of how and why. And the answer to those questions, I believe, lies in understanding the precise sequence of events on the night in question." He began to pace the library with the measured stride of a man reconstructing a complex narrative. At 9 o'clock, Lord Brackenstall was in his study, in excellent spirits according to Adrian Carmichael's account. At some point thereafter, perhaps around 9:30 or 10, he retired to the library to work on correspondence regarding alterations to his will. He was troubled by something, knowledge of an affair, perhaps, or suspicions regarding his wife's emotional state. The lamp was left burning in case he required additional light, or perhaps as a deliberate choice for some other reason yet to be determined. He paused at the window, gazing out at the grounds beyond. At approximately midnight, Lady Brackenstall departed the house ostensibly to meet Thomas Ashford. This much is confirmed by Miss Carmichael's observation, but here is where the narrative acquires a certain duplicity. Lady Brackenstall did meet with Ashford, and she did return to the house approximately 30 to 40 minutes later. But what she did not mention, what she has in fact been concealing, is that she subsequently left the house again. Whimsy turned back to face the room with an expression of terrible clarity. She did so at precisely 1 o'clock, the time when both Adrian Carmichael and Mrs. Henning heard a door close. But this time, she did not depart alone. She took with her the individual who would, some hours later, become Lord Brackenstall's murderer. Lady Brackenstall's denial emerged as barely a whisper. "That's not... I couldn't have..." But Whimsy continued, his voice maintaining the relentless precision of a man dealing out cards in a game whose rules had been established long before. "You see, the difficulty with this case is that everyone has been lying, though not, I suspect, about the central facts of the murder itself. Inspector Croft was convinced that the crime was a simple matter of passion or inheritance. Adrian Carmichael was anxious to conceal his awareness of disturbances in the household. Mrs. Henning was protective of the family's reputation. And you, Lady Brackenstall, were attempting to shield someone considerably closer to you than Thomas Ashford." He turned directly to Miranda with an expression of profound sadness. "Miss Carmichael, I believe you have been conducting your own investigation into these events with considerably more thoroughness than I initially credited. Would you be so kind as to reveal what you discovered during your nocturnal perambulations last night?" Miranda's expression shifted from satisfaction to something approaching fear. "I didn't see everything," she said carefully, "but I saw Eleanor go out again around 1 o'clock, and I saw her return with Adrian." The revelation hung in the library air like a blade suspended above an executioner's block. Adrian Carmichael, who had been standing near the doorway with the apparent nonchalance of a man observing events from considerable distance, suddenly shifted his entire bearing. His face acquired the pallor of someone who had just perceived the absolute necessity of abandonment of pretense. Inspector Croft's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket, though whether reaching for notebook or something more substantial remained uncertain. Whimsy, however, maintained the relaxed posture of a man for whom all surprises had been anticipated hours prior, his grey eyes fixed upon Adrian with an expression of profound compassion combined with absolute certainty. "You see, the difficulty with murder," Whimsy said, addressing the room with the measured tones of a man delivering a lecture of considerable importance, "is that it requires not merely motive and opportunity, but also a particular psychological predisposition that most individuals simply do not possess. Adrian Carmichael possessed both motive and opportunity. His financial situation, whilst comfortable, was dependent upon his uncle's continued goodwill. The proposed alterations to Lord Brackenstall's will threatened to reduce substantially the inheritance Adrian had anticipated. More significantly, Adrian harboured a deep-seated resentment regarding his uncle's marriage to Lady Brackenstall, a resentment born not of moral disapprobation but of jealousy and wounded pride. Adrian's denial emerged, but it lacked conviction, suggesting he perceived the futility of continued pretense. Whimsy continued, his voice maintaining its inexorable precision. What Adrian did not initially possess, however, was the courage or the ruthlessness to act upon these desires. He might have harboured fantasies of his uncle's demise, as such weak and resentful men often do, but acting upon those fantasies requires a particular hardening of the conscience that Adrian had not yet achieved. Enter Lady Brackenstall, who presented him with precisely the opportunity, and, more importantly, the psychological justification he required. He turned to face Lady Brackenstall directly, his expression conveying neither judgment nor forgiveness but merely the clinical assessment of a man observing human nature in its more uncomfortable manifestations. "You informed Adrian of Thomas Ashford's reappearance, didn't you? You told him of your midnight appointment, knowing full well that Adrian was awake and listening, knowing that his jealousy and insecurity would be substantially inflamed by this revelation. You may not have explicitly suggested that he murder his uncle, but you communicated with sufficient clarity that the action was not merely possible but perhaps even necessary if he wished to prevent the loss of his inheritance and his position within the household." Lady Brackenstall's denial emerged as a strangled sound, but Whimsy raised a hand, continuing without pause. "At 1 o'clock you departed the house with Adrian, Your story regarding a second meeting with Thomas Ashford was fabrication. Instead, you went to the village and returned alone approximately 30 minutes later. Adrian, meanwhile, remained behind. He entered the library where his uncle was still engaged in composing his letter to the solicitor. What occurred next is almost certainly a matter of impulse rather than premeditation. Some words were exchanged. Adrian, inflamed by jealousy and fear of disinheriting, seized the letter opener from the desk and struck his uncle with a violence that surprised even himself. He paused, allowing this image to settle into the consciousness of those assembled. The letter opener penetrated between the shoulder blades with sufficient force to cause instantaneous death, or near enough for practical purposes. Adrian, confronted suddenly with the reality of his action rather than its fantasy, became paralyzed by shock. It was you, Lady Brackenstall, who possessed sufficient presence of mind to arrange the scene in such manner as to conceal the crime's actual time of commission. You left the lamp burning to suggest that Lord Brackenstall had been working throughout the night. You arranged his body with sufficient care to avoid evidence of struggle. And then you departed, leaving Adrian to await discovery in a state of psychological dissolution. Adrian's collapse was not dramatic, but rather the gradual subsidence of a structure that had been fundamentally undermined. He sank into a chair with movements that suggested his entire skeleton had become suddenly unfamiliar to him. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I only wanted to frighten him, to make him understand that he couldn't simply abandon us, that he couldn't change his will without consequence. The letter opener was in my hand, and he was saying such terrible things about Eleanor, and I didn't mean to kill him." Whimsy's expression remained unchanged, though something in his eyes suggested a certain weariness at the infinite capacity of human nature to produce justifications for unjustifiable actions. "Murderers rarely intend the consequences of their actions," he observed quietly. "They merely intend the action itself, and then attempt to rewrite causality according to their emotional requirements. Inspector Croft, I believe you will find sufficient evidence to secure a conviction against Mr. Adrian Carmichael for the murder of his uncle, Lord Brackenstall. The timeline, the letter opener, the lamp deliberately left burning, all of these elements constitute physical evidence of considerable cogency." He turned to Lady Brackenstall with an expression that somehow conveyed both sympathy and contempt in equal measure. "As for you, Lady Brackenstall, your involvement is considerably more ambiguous from a legal perspective, though from a moral perspective it admits of no such ambiguity. You may not have struck the blow, but you created the circumstances and the psychological pressure that rendered its striking inevitable. Whether that constitutes criminal complicity in the eyes of the law remains a matter for others to determine." As Inspector Croft moved to place Adrian under formal arrest, Whimsy retrieved his coat from the hall with the movements of a man who had concluded a task of considerable unpleasantness and wished merely to depart. At the threshold, he paused and turned back to address the assembled household with a final observation. The lamp, he said, was perhaps the most illuminating detail in the entire investigation, not because it revealed the murderer's identity, but because it revealed the murderer's psychology. A guilty conscience burning through the night, seeking to conceal the time of death by suggesting that the victim had simply been engaged in innocent labor. How very human, how very futile, and how very criminal. With that, he departed into the November darkness, leaving behind him the wreckage of secrets and the terrible clarity that comes from understanding that most murders are not the products of elaborate schemes, but rather of ordinary weakness confronting extraordinary temptation.